I'm going to introduce James Spencer. His talk today is Protecting the Forest, starting at the roots, AD hardening and defence using modern techniques. Big round of applause for James.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. My name's James, and for the next hour I'm going to be taking a deep dive into one of my favourite topics to dive into, which is hardening of Active Directory environments. So a little bit about me. I'm lucky enough in my day job to hunt identity and authentication attacks all around the globe in the Overwatch team at CrowdStrike. Previously I've worked at Monash Uni and Lithnet, working on identity security and tooling. And just a little bit of background, my first job out of high school, I was a sysadmin, where I was given domain admin privileges on my first day. And I'm very happy to say that ever since, I've not needed a production domain admin account, which I'm very grateful for. Now, today I'm hoping to really give you something that's not just another AD talk. And what do I mean by that? So in my job, I see hundreds of Active Directory attacks every single week, and that's both by criminals and by nation states. And I'm here today because about 95% of these attacks, I'd say, are completely avoidable. And I think as an industry, we've often misdirected our blame towards admins in that they should just have hardened it, they should make it more secure. I think they've really been dealt a bad hand in that they've been given a product or a suite of products that are business critical, that are really insecure out of the box, that take extensive knowledge for them to secure, and they, often they don't know how much of a risk it is. And a lot of literature out there on Active Directory security really favours attackers. There's a lot of attack tools, but not a lot of literature on hardening from core principles. And so for most admins, they're exposed to Active Directory hardening for the first time during recovery. And so today we'll be looking at some practical, real-world, production-ready techniques for hardening AD. And really this is for people with shit to do. It's not about looking at the latest and greatest tools, but we're going to be breaking this down to core principles. And by that, we want to kill off entire classes of attacks, not just defend against the latest ones. So high-level overview, we'll be looking at why adversaries who keep targeting Active Directory keep winning. We'll break down attacks into a number of different kind of major classes. And we'll start building a blueprint for what a modern Active Directory may look like, so including things like authentication silos and RPC filters. And we'll finish off with some ideas around threat hunting and detection development for Active Directory. So a bit of background, what makes an AD? So AD is a whole suite of tools, and it's really built on a lot of open tech standards and placed all under one roof. So in an AD, you've got a few major areas. You've got the directory service, which is based on X500 and LDAP. X500, before it we had things like Novell, which were compatible in that area. Authentication, they brought in Kerberos from MIT, which came out of their project Athena. RPC, which came out of things very similar to VAX, Solaris, OpenVMS. PKI from X509. So all of these things open standards. Now, of course, anyone who knows Microsoft, there's a million extensions to all of these standards that they added that gradually became more open over the years. But finally, we had a lot of enhanced features coming over from NT4, so things like group policy, DFS. And AD also has a lot of interoperability. And at the time it came out, this was interoperability with existing systems. So things like LAN manager hashes, NTLM, these were compatible with existing systems where newer options from day one, like Kerberos, were there, but we needed to support existing systems. And those really stuck around. And it's really a product of its time. So, it came out before AES, so we got all our 90s hits of, triple DES, MD4, MD5, RC4 scattered everywhere. A default allow model with global super users, which we'll get into in a bit, but where effectively users can log in anywhere by default, and you have to restrict where they can't go. And finally, everything's a server with a huge attack surface. So really a very, these days, we probably wouldn't build things like this, but this is what we've got. So it's a really uneven playing field for a few reasons. So one is insecure defaults, which favour compatibility over security. And a lot of this too is difficult because Microsoft's DNA is backwards compatibility. So the defaults that never really change because it breaks backwards compatibility. Highly difficult to audit in that there's really, I think Bloodhound's the first tool that ever really got it right in that it's a graph. There's not just, there's so many different ways to persist in AD that it's hard to audit what's actually set up. And the attack surface is almost comically large. And these days, the status quo of defending AD depends on hundreds and hundreds of specific configurations scattered across hundreds of different places. And it's to the extent that the attack surface is so large that often a new attack is just someone discovering something Microsoft did in the 90s and forgot about and exploiting it. So there's not really a definitive proactive framework for securing AD. I think the closest, and I know there may be a few people in the room involved, but at the ACSC they released an amazing guide detecting and mitigating Active Directory compromises, which is probably the best guide out there. So a big shout out to that team. But even it starts at the point of you've just been compromised, how can you start remediating? And I think that this has really made it hard for admins over the years to start building things right from the start. And for a lot of us, we've just ended up taking hundreds of attack tool readmes, figuring out their mitigations and piling those into a framework, which is not really a security framework, but it's the best that a lot of us have got. So what I want to do today is kind of present what I see as a blueprint for securing AD. But we want to treat the causes and not the symptoms. So stopping attacks is cool, but really we want to kill off attack classes to prevent future stuff, not just stuff we know about. So we'll set a couple of goals, and by that I mean we want to use as much native tooling as possible. I think the less that we have to bolt on to Active Directory, the better. And it also means the enforcement happens in real time in line. We want to be something that can be retrofitted into brownfield environments. Quite often we have stuff that's, you can start from scratch building it securely, but no one's really able to do that these days, especially in massive environments. And, we want to prioritize key accounts and machines based on the level of damage they can do to the environment, not just start trying to do everything at once. And we don't really want to rely on workstation side mitigations either. We want to assume that workstations and end users are all compromised as our base. Otherwise, we're just assuming that everything is managed and we haven't got any issues on workstations. So we want to target the common weaknesses that are exploited by attackers. So just a bit of brief history about AD. I guess it's worth looking where a lot of these things came from that we're still got today. 1987 and 94, we had LAN Manager. So, it started with IBM. So this is where things like SMB started originating. Version 2, which was with 3Com, or a combination of some 3Com stuff, started bringing in, SMB over TCP/IP. And while it didn't get the market share that, say, Novell did in the day, it still got things kicking around like the LAN Manager hash, if you've ever seen those. 93 to around 2000, we had NT domains, which are a lot more similar to what we've got today. It's effectively the local SAM hive on a DC being exposed. So no structure to the directory, but still a lot of the same core concepts. In around 96, Exchange 4 came out. It was the first version of Exchange, but it just used to be called Microsoft Mail before. And it included a big new directory service for all the users in Exchange. This code was copied over, became part of Windows as Active Directory in around 1999, so with Server 2000. So some early versions of Windows 2000 had Active Directory stuff under Exchange. That's where it came from. So in 2008, Azure Active Directory was launched, and as we all know, this is when Microsoft decided to officially deprecate AD. Well, not quite, still kicking at this point, but don't worry, 2023, Azure Active Directory is renamed to Enter ID, so they finally put AD to rest. No, so now these days, 95% of enterprises are using AD, 88% of the Fortune 1000 according to Microsoft, and second to Excel, it's keeping the whole corporate world live as well as your local red team. So it's absolutely everywhere. And I think one thing to note here is if we look at, how long ago, LAN Manager and NT4 came out with all of these primitives, we've kind of got backwards compatibility with systems that are at this point a generation ago. And that's a problem when where we're dealing with things like cryptography. And a lot of these weaknesses stem from this backwards compatibility, which is still, for the most part, on by default. So kind of looking at some of the attacks that we see out in the real world, I guess breaking them down into three kind of major categories. The first is overprivilege. Active Directory has a really outdated model for privileged accounts, and it's really fragile and complex to delegate rights to other people. The surface area is massive, so it's spread across multiple protocols, and a lot's enabled by default, and there's a lot of foot guns across that attack surface. And finally, persistence. So Active Directory is full of long-term, unchangeable secrets that are poorly protected in a lot of environments, and this opens the door to a lot of long-term persistence in Active Directory environments. So kind of looking at overprivilege to start off with. So if the null reference was $1 billion mistake, as called by its creator, I reckon the domain admin group was Microsoft's $1 trillion mistake. Why do I say this? So we think these days, something like a schema admin. It's probably a good example of something we do these days that's a reasonable idea. We have a single group, and if you're a member of it, you can change the schema in Active Directory. That's it. That's the only privilege you get. But instead, domain admins is a group that's not just, as the name implies, a directory admin. It's an admin of everything, or effectively a God mode account, which is something that these days it's not something you would really want to give out. It's full control of every object in the domain, replication rights for everything in the domain, and it's local administrator on every single workstation and server in the environment. And so once one of these accounts is compromised, a domain can't be trusted anymore. There's so many ways that an actor can maintain persistence that even Microsoft recommends a full rebuild. Now, are many people actually doing this in the event of a compromise? Probably not, but that's the level of access you can gain with these kind of privileges. And in the wild, in my day job, I would see hundreds of these accounts compromised every week. No matter how much has been talked about over the years, reducing domain admins, it's still absolutely everywhere. And really, it's become, for a lot of people, if you have permission to give things DA, it's the hammer that you hit every problem with in a lot of environments. And so this group is a member by default of the built-in administrators group on every machine by default. And in looking at this, I tried to find some guidance from Microsoft on, what should I be doing in this spot? And they're saying these days that it should not be removed for supportability and disaster recovery purposes. And if it's been removed, you should be adding it back. Now, I strongly disagree with this. I've made an amended version here saying that you should modify it for disaster avoidance purposes. And if you have removed it, kick back and have a beer because you're doing something right. But this is the kind of problem we've got, is that as security people, we know that these are really high value accounts that are being compromised, but admins are still being told in the docs, don't touch it. You want to keep it there. And so I think the other thing too is when it comes to overprivilege, I think a lot of IT people over the years have said, let's remove local admin rights because that'll fix it, right? And I think, say, for example, the Essential 8 talks about admin rights. And a lot of IT people seem to go, we'll just remove it from our end users because we're not the problem. And at the end of the day, most of these large-scale AD intrusions that we see don't happen because an end user has local admin. And many red teamers I've spoken to in the room don't really care if they have local admin. But the thing is that they are going after is IT people's accounts, because these accounts are the ticking time bombs in the organisations most of the time. They've often got wide-ranging admin access, and they're not the accounts that are being targeted for remediation by the IT teams themselves. IT people have often exempted themselves from the policies that they're applying to end users. And AD intrusions mostly happen, and I say mostly because I see this every single day, they happen because these overprivileged and unrestricted accounts are stolen and used to move laterally and in many cases escalate privileges. So it's often the IT people's accounts that are the real targets here. And a quote from Ryan over at Lithnet, who's I've referenced a lot over the years, is this idea of domain admin accounts really should be treated like uranium, right? You want to have as few of them as possible. You only want them to be handled by trained professionals, minimize contact with them, keep them safe and locked away when they're not in use, and only use them in approved containment areas. And I think just if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, administrative privileges are a burden that you are carrying and not a right. And I said at the start of this talk that I'm excited that I haven't been DA ever since my first sysadmin job, and that's correct, because if you're not terrified to be a domain admin, you shouldn't be one. Simple as that. At the end of the day, if you're not comfortable with your name being the domain admin account that's in the DFIR report, don't subject yourself to being a domain admin. Only seek the privilege you need. And this extends to if you're not on the tools, you don't need domain admin rights. It's not a status symbol. It's terrifying. And if you don't understand the risk that you're bringing to the organisation by carrying that around, you don't want it. And if you can count your DAs on more than one hand, you've got a big problem. I think the more that you expand this privilege and it becomes unwieldy, I think you really want to reduce the number of these accounts that can be used for lateral movement. This applies to all different kinds of admins, but domain admins in particular, we see in the wild a lot. So I'm going to dive a bit first into NTLM. So I won't go too deep, but NTLM's a challenge-based authentication protocol. The idea is that instead of having to talk to an authentication server, I can negotiate with the server that I want to connect to, and it handles communication with an authentication service. So NTLM version 1, was triple DES, unsalted, easily rainbow tabled. Some analysis of it has shown that probably it's a protocol Microsoft never expected to ever be made public. Version 2, they started improving things a lot. So they moved to MD5, HMAC, and some more mutual authentication mechanisms. Unfortunately, this didn't fix it either, and this is a really great reference from SpectreOps. It's a great talk paper that's come out recently around modern attacks around NTLM. And realistically, in most environments, even if there's full Kerberos setup, any time something breaks or doesn't quite work, NTLM is the fallback. So most workstations will still always fall back to NTLM. Mostly in a modern environment, mostly version 2, but still version 1 in other environments. The attacks, there's almost too many to count, but they kind of break down into 2 categories. One, I can coerce or trick a server or a workstation into sending me its credentials, which it may crack or relay, and that's where relaying comes in. So I'm basically taking credentials that have been sent to me and passing them on to targets impersonating that client. Microsoft's now deprecated NTLM officially, but there's a lot of mechanisms that they've started to talk about to replace it, saying cases where you don't have direct communication with a domain controller, but they're still not publicly available. So we're kind of in a weird situation, but I would suggest that with this notice, go have a chat to your team about NTLM deprecation for your organisation after BSides, because it's on its last legs. In the wild, just to provide some context, this is an example of a case that I worked earlier this year. 6 minutes from an implant that starts listening on a Linux box. An attacker was able to issue a certificate by relaying credentials for a PKI server, so they could pretend to be the PKI server, and they're able to issue certificates for anyone in the domain within about 6 minutes. So this is, the kind of speed that these attacks kind of work in. Kerberos is probably the main protocol for authentication in Active Directory. So Kerberos named after three-headed dog of Hades. It was developed at MIT, and it's a very solid protocol, and I'll stand by that. And the reason I think it's quite strong and solid is that it was made extensible from the beginning. So pre-authentication data, ways you identify yourself, and E-types, which are encryption types, which have grown over the years. Microsoft, as they have with every protocol, has added lots of extensions. So the first one is probably about 150 pages all up of different extensions they've added. One of the things they added was RC4, which wasn't originally in the spec, but they added it probably just out of love of the game. Kerberosting is, something I never thought to hear of in the Senate in the US, but here we are. Kerberosting was developed by 10 men over at Red Siege. And the idea here, and there's lots of different types of these attacks, but the idea is that Kerberos uses your password as a symmetric key. So if you have a weak password, you can crack it. And, there's lots and lots of different ways to kind of abuse that in various forms. Forgery, so talking about persistence before, if you've stolen certain kinds of secrets, depending on the secrets you've stolen, you're able to mint or forge certain types of tickets. And there's also delegation. So delegation is a way for a service or something you're connecting to act on your behalf. So say SharePoint doing something in the background for you is really dangerous because if someone's sitting on that service, they can, especially if that delegation is unconstrained, so they can do anything as you, they can steal kind of perform anything on with your user account's permissions. Out in the wild, this is another case I've worked where we saw within 5 minutes of a VPN device being compromised, which is a great access entry point for a lot of actors these days. Kerberos gets a domain admin service account, which I think hadn't been rotated in 15 years, still using RC4, and within 5 minutes we were seeing a domain replication, so stealing all the secrets out of the domain via that VPN appliance, which is, that's how quick these things happen. Another one is RPC and SMB. So this is kind of an area that I think not a lot of people know how bad the attack surface is here. But as a little attacker, messing around in the school computer lab, I first got introduced to RPC, not really knowing what it was, but I knew that I could shut down my mates' computers via the shutdown dialog. So kind of having a look, how does this actually work? So RPC exposes interfaces and endpoints. The idea here is that there's a set of functions that are exposed over the network, kind of, similar to COM, where a remote user can call particular operations on a remote machine. So there's a few different transports, but the main two are, one is what we've got at the bottom. So TCP/IP, so a random port gets assigned to an endpoint, and you can connect via TCP/IP. And there's named pipes, which are effectively going over SMB. So a remote user can call these particular endpoints remotely and execute operations on a remote machine. So kind of looking at this, you may think, well, how many of these are there? So if you can change it in MMC, so the Microsoft Management Console, odds are that there's an RPC interface available to remotely perform operations on a remote machine. So a new domain controller, and this is 2025, started to get better, but there's 77 open RPC interfaces on just a domain controller. And when we talk about named pipes, you get this default share on a Windows server called IPC, which allows you to basically make an SMB connection and start talking to these RPC interfaces. So, for example, this is just a subset of some interfaces that are available on Windows. So, for example, you control services on the machine. So, start services, remote registry, so read and write to the registry, SAM, so you can start doing a lot of things with the users on the machine. Volume shadow copy is a big one, so taking snapshots of files, especially good for snapshotting domain controllers. Schedule tasks, so starting new scheduled tasks. WMI is via RPC, which is in DCOM, which is a whole nother can of worms. But also things like ADCS, so requesting certificates, happen over RPC. So I guess an example a lot of people would know, PSExec, which is you're able to start services remotely on a machine. It uses one RPC interface, which is the Service Control Manager RPC interface, where it's able to basically drop a file in the admin share, which is your Windows directory, and start that service and effectively execute code. So we've got this huge attack surface, and in the tools like Impacket, which is very, very common tool these days, implement support for a huge number of these RPC interfaces and being able to call them remotely. So out in the wild, I had a look through some cases from the past month, and this is just a small subset of different attacks that you can do over RPC or SMB. So these range from, starting remote services, coercing NTLM, using WMI or remote registry to either steal credentials. Obviously, this is just surface level, but there's so many of these that are just so commonly abused. And the attack surface isn't that well known. It's not easy to see unless you know what you're looking for. And I guess finally on persistence. So, Active Directory has a lot of long-term keys that are stored in the directory. And these keys are often things that symmetric and often sometimes can't be rotated. So you've got things like people's password hashes. The hash of the KRB TGT account, which is basically it's the special account used for signing Active Directory Kerberos tickets, or encrypting, sorry. Trusted domain hashes, so when you've got trusts, so other organizations that you're connecting to, or other forests. DP API backup keys, which are used to, when files are encrypted on your machine, you can often move to another laptop and your encrypted files will still work. And the other one is KDS root keys, so things like GMSAs, so group managed service accounts in Active Directory, and lapsed passwords are encrypted with these keys. And due to the role, one example of these is DP API backup keys. And once these are stolen, there's no supported way to actually rotate them. And Microsoft's only suggestion is, if you suspect they've been stolen, to create a whole new domain and move users to it. So really, at the end of the day, domain admins have these privileges, and there's other ways to get them too. But realistically, once someone's replicating stuff out of the domain or stealing, these secrets, it's game over. There's no way to recover the domain and be 100% confident that nothing bad has actually happened. So that's kind of just a very high-level overview of all of these kind of root causes. So what I'm going to do is start diving into what mitigations do we actually have. I think the first one I really wanted to dive into is making danger an opt-in. And I really think Windows these days should have a box that pops up, on a domain controller. It's like, do you know what NT4 is? If you answer no, I hope I don't, what's NT4, then we should just be turning off a huge number of these protocols that are not needed anymore. And I think take an opportunity to look at what parts of your environment actually need these legacy protocols. And don't make it an all or nothing. I think a lot of people will go, well, I still need it in one part of my environment. But it's looking at, well, what places don't need it? And a big one is, does every workstation and server in your environment need to be a file server? If you have things like shared storage that you want people to be using, you should instead be thinking, do we need to enable an SMB server on every single workstation that exposes their C drive, that exposes all these RPC interfaces? Probably not. And even if there are places where you do need it, you can make it opt-in. So opting servers in to be a file server. Things like RPC. So most workstations, if you've got things like Intune, SCCM, they're not going to need remote RPC to connect to your workstations and servers. They can do it all locally. So if you've got these agent-based solutions, for the most part, you shouldn't really need a lot of RPC interface, especially in workstations. And also things like NTLM. Now, NTLM is not something that you can just easily turn off with no tests and checking, but there may be parts of your environment that are actually not using it at all and can be kind of have these features disabled. So enabling auditing in these areas is really good to start seeing where can I start turning things off. And just as a sample, and I've done this in production a number of times, is just make group policy that says, I want to disable SMB on this machine. I want to disable creating the admin shares, so the C $ or admin $. And you can make AD groups that say opt in or opt out. So you can start opting in to a group of servers that you want to pilot. And then eventually you might get to the point where we know that there's about 10 servers left that we actually need these things on. We want to remediate and opt them out. So instead of having to go, we need 100% of the environment to be compliant, before we start turning these things off, target the vast majority, because a lot of the places won't need it. The other thing too is that in some places we can't really disable RPC or SMB entirely, and a good example of that, servers. And I've got on my blog, just on the side here, like a big list of all of the different RPC interfaces that are at least documented from Microsoft, and some servers have a huge number of these. So some of them are just required. But we really want to reduce the attack surface here in a lot of cases. So it looks like this has covered it up a bit, but Windows has this little known feature called RPC filters. It's part of the Windows firewall, but it's only exposed via the command line and not via the GUI, which has been a real pain point. And previously this was limited to, I will just quickly, here we go. So This was limited to a single interface at a time, so you could only enable or disable a particular interface. This is great until you get to interfaces with multiple use cases. So here's a very common one. The first two RPC calls here, this is from the Directory Replication Service remote protocol. Great read if you need some nighttime reading. Has two opcodes that allow you to replicate or take data out of the domain. So this is how domain controllers share data. But opnum 12 is something called crack names. And this is how every computer in your environment turns a username into a SID or an identifier. If you turn off this whole interface, you break domain replication. And even if you enforce it just between domain controllers, no computers will be able to authenticate. So kind of a catch-22. But recently, Microsoft added something in newer versions of Windows that allow you to filter at the opnum level. So now they're actually granular enough to be useful. So I can now say specific methods are available or not available. And now I started making a pull request to add this functionality to an existing module, and as luck would have it, this very morning, a colleague texted me and showed that there was a product that landed this morning from Michael, who's behind DS internals, and has made this PowerShell module. So beat me to it, but more finished than mine was this morning. And this, for example, in this case, finally you can say, do you know what? Domain controllers can replicate from me, but anyone else block it. Just that particular operation. So this kind of thing in places where we have to have some forms of RPC open, we can get a lot more restrictive with what we're actually enabling, which is a big win compared to having to have these massive attack surfaces open, and a great way to start reducing, rather than opening everything up, making it all or nothing, we can get a lot more specific with what we're opening up in our environments. And, this is just an example, but, there's all of these things that we can control. So, for example, we can, with RPC filters, start saying that only particular users can call these interfaces. We can start saying that, particular IPs can call them. All these kinds of different things. We can also turn on auditing, so we've got much better visibility into these interfaces, even if we've not gamed to turn them off. Another great control that I think is underappreciated is something called the protected users group. So it's been around since around server 2012, 2012 R2, and it's a group that's basically, if you put someone in here, a bunch of old protocols and dangerous mechanisms are disabled for those users. So if I kind of take a look, it's enforced at the DC, so it's enforced regardless of where you're authenticating from, and anyone who's in that group can't use NTLM. So they're forced to use Kerberos. They can't use DES or RC4 encryption in Kerberos, so, very easy to crack encryption. They can't use Kerberos delegation in any way, which I will note breaks things like SharePoint. But again, this is for protected users. And they can't log in after they have to re-authenticate after 4 hours. They can't just keep renewing their tickets. And finally, any workstation in the environment won't cache the credentials anymore. So even if you log in, it's not going to be sitting in memory. Now, this isn't meaning it's now safe to go put your domain admin credentials everywhere, but it's a fail-safe. And the other good thing, and what a lot of these modern features I'm going to be talking about have, is this has really great logs. So you can see here an example of where I had a domain admin account, logged on to a workstation where, it was using NTLM, and I get a log in the domain on the DC that's saying this admin tried to log in somewhere they're not supposed to using NTLM, which is a great way to suddenly have a lead or, an audit log that you can build high fidelity detections off that are specific to your environment. And so these you also get success logs. So any protected admin that you've deemed protected in your environment, you've now got great visibility into when they log in your logs. The other thing is smart cards. And this is a control that's actually, a lot more accessible than people think. But, we often talk about, well, why doesn't AD have, really strong, much stronger authentication, multi-factor authentication? The other thing we always hear is, and I see every day, is a domain admin account password's been stolen. New shit's come to light. over the last few years, Have I Been Pwned has really come out and shown us that, having passwords in a lot of cases is not good, and having a domain admin of password of summer 2025 ! Because that makes it secure, it's not really holding up. So YubiKeys are around. I think current exchange rate's $90. Obviously, there's lots of other ways to do it, but you can basically force that certain users can only log on with a smart card. And this is a great way to enforce, rather than having passwords floating around, having certificates. Now, I think I would be remiss to mention this without saying that this mechanism has been one that's been abused, and a lot of the red teams in here have been very busy minting certificates. So I guess in doing this, I would say really look at using smart cards for your admins. But one is start looking at auditing them. So Locksmith's a really great tool by a friend Jake of mine, which is a great way to just look at certificates that are misconfigured, where you can privilege escalate. And I think the other thing I'd recommend is something called Tame My Certs. Active Directory Certificate Services has a way to basically run policy modules which validate certificate requests when they come in. And Tame My Certs is a tool that lets you define custom policies, deny certain certificate requests, much better logging. And yeah, it's a really great project and free tool that's very valuable in getting a lot more visibility into ADCS. But smart cards for admins is definitely something that's worthwhile. The next thing I want to talk about is fast. So this is an RFC that I've read many, many times, and I'm hoping that you don't have to dive into the same level I have by explaining it to you a bit today. So as we said before, Microsoft's added a lot of stuff to Kerberos over the years, and a lot of those additions have been, at the time were a bit ad hoc and not really standardized. So they put out this standard which was saying, look, we want to standardize how everyone's extending Kerberos and just retrospectively documenting what we've done. And then they also added this thing called FAST, which is Flexible Authentication Secure Tunneling. And this effectively, as they're saying, stops offline dictionary attacks. So those Kerberoasting attacks that we spoke about before. And in Server 2012 R2, which came out the following year, we got these capabilities that allowed us to, in Microsoft's words, limit high-value account use to high-value assets, to high-value hosts, sorry. And the idea here is that instead of just authenticating users, we're authenticating the user and the device at the same time. So I'm going to try and explain really fast. And this is after taking a while to understand it. The idea here is that first, when you authenticate, your computer logs in and it generates a session key and makes what's called an ARMA key. So this is generated from the computer's login as the computer's user. This key is then used to encrypt your user authentication session, which is, what's normally just encrypted with your password. So no matter what that is. And once you authenticate, the information about the computer you've logged in from is stapled to your ticket. So wherever you go, all of your authentication now talks about where you actually logged in from. So with this primitive, Microsoft made something called authentication silos. Authentication silos are a system where you can effectively say, I'm going to make a bucket where I put users, service accounts, computers, and I can enforce where they can be used, who can use them, and where they can't be used. So for users, you can say, if this user is a service account, who can authenticate to this user? And also I can say, which computers can this user authenticate to or log in on? For computers, I can say who can use this computer or who can auth on this computer. And for authenticate for service accounts, similar to users, I can say who can authenticate to that service and which computers can it run on. And this is enforced at the domain controller. So even if you have credentials, things just stop working. And so just as an example here, this is a case where in the lab, I've got a domain admin password, I'm putting it into these attack tools, and nothing's working because I'm not able to provide the login from a computer that's actually authorized. And in a lot of modern computers, these passwords that are, the machine account passwords are stored in virtualization-based security, so a lot more secure. But also, even if you have that computer, you're still tied to, authenticating specifically from machines rather than from, say, a VPN appliance. For users, if they log in somewhere they're not supposed to, they see, you're configured not to be able to use this PC. And the best thing is that you get amazing authentication logs. So this is a log that I've wanted for years, which is this user's not allowed to log on here, and here's why. So I can see that I'm in the domain admin silo. I tried to log on to a particular machine, so you can see an IP, what I tried to log into, and I get this both in when the silo is enforced, but also if it's in audit mode. So an example of this, just a very simple example, I can make a PAW silo, which we'll get into in a little bit. PAW's a privileged access workstation. So I can say that the only people that are allowed to log on to these machines, so these admin laptops, are people in the domain admin silo. In the domain admin silo, I can say that these users are only ever allowed to log into two places, these privileged admin machines and domain controllers. And so this means that even if I have credentials, these users can only ever log on from two places. And this doesn't matter if you literally have their credentials. So you can have their smart card, you can have their password, you still can't authenticate to these from places you're not supposed to. Also, it doesn't matter if you have an ADCS privilege escalation. If you've got a certificate, you can't actually use it because they're restricted to specific machines. And as we said, it's enforced at the domain controller. So even if the device is managed or unmanaged, it doesn't matter. We're not relying on workstation policy. We're enforcing it at a level where it doesn't matter where you're coming from and what the policy is on your local machine. Now, this works on Windows 8.1 Plus, and it works on Linux. I don't just say that as in theoretically. I've deployed it in production across thousands of Linux machines. And as I said, it can be enabled in audit mode. So even if you're like, I just want to say, theoretically, this is where my domain admin should be logging in and get logs on failures. One, it's a great threat hunting technique because you've got a fantastic log specifically targeting particular users, but it also lets you ease into it rather than having to just go all in. Now, I guess as a bit of a model, Microsoft came out with this idea called tiering. Tiering is essentially a way to structure Active Directory in terms of privilege. So we've got control, we've got authentication. Control goes down, authentication goes up. So tier 0 is where you've got your domain admins, your PKI, your domain controllers. If you have control there, you have control over everything. Also, something to keep in mind, the host, the VMware hosts or virtualization hosts your domain controllers are on, are still tier 0. We see them attacked a lot because you can still get to the domain controllers. Management plane is where you've got things that can manage other enterprise resources. So SCCM, backups, printing, why things like printing servers are able to give drivers to other machines. So, it's a way to deploy malware. So anything here is got some level of privilege over other machines or control. Also things like your EDR need to be protected because they, again, have control over workstations. Finally, you've got things like, tier 2, which is where you've got your end users, workstations, app servers, things like that. And the idea here is pretty simple. We want to restrict what admins can control, and we want to restrict where they can authenticate. So we have this concept called a PAW, Privileged Access Workstation, which is a hardened physical machine for trusted admin work. And I keep saying things like about physical machines. I think that's really important. So if you control a host, you control the users on it. And if you control the users, you control everything that those users manage. So using a PAW, we ensure that sensitive admin tasks only happen on machines we trust, and sensitive credentials are only ever exposed to these devices that we trust. They're tiered, so we have specific laptops for, say, domain admins that are separate from tier 1 users. And we have separate productivity machines. So you're not running things like Slack, Microsoft Office, web browsing on these machines. They're used purely for admin tasks. They're, only ever use certificate authentication. You've always got line of sight to a DC, and they're locked down with things like app allow listing, and a lot of logging. And the big thing here that I really want to stress is that these are physical machines, and maybe it's a hot take, but I absolutely hate jump boxes. They are an exploit target, but also if you are logging in from an untrusted machine to a trusted one, it doesn't make you trusted. You're still typing your credentials and exposing, all of your sensitive admin work to a machine that's not as secure as the one you're connecting to. And with things like silos, we've got really strong things where we can enforce that, the device that you're coming in from is stable to your authentication. The more you have a direct line of sight from a trusted keyboard all the way to a trusted target is a lot better in terms of security, in my opinion. So is this ready for production? And I'd say yes, it is. In real-world environments, I've deployed this, and in the environment I previously worked in, we deployed this for around 2,000 servers and 250,000 users and 40,000 workstations. So I won't go too deep into it today, but at Monash Uni, they published, on CSIRT team, published the Active Directory Security Guide, which is their model for splitting Active Directory into what they call blast zones. So essentially here, we can restrict where admins are, and by breaking the environment into smaller and smaller areas, just using these same controls we talked about today, so silos and just, basically enforcing that certain services can't authenticate to other places in the environment, and ensuring that users and admin users in those environments are restricted in the damage that they can cause. So this is splitting out the tiers that we talked about before from Microsoft into these smaller little buckets. And the idea here is that, say, instead of having just domain admins, we can say that you're an Entra ID sync admin in a separate zone, and you have a very specific delegation to that area. If your account's compromised, you can damage just the zone you're in and not other places. And that's really important. We want to contain, if there is a breach, contain the extent of it. And things like silos are really good at that because we can enforce where these accounts are admins, and we can enforce basically where they can't authenticate. And that allows us to subtly start going, instead of having these global admins and these IT accounts that are admins everywhere, it allows us to restrict it to very, very fine-grained areas. And if there is a breach, we've restricted it. So for example, if we split it out, say our workstation management from our server management, so separate SCCMs for servers and workstations. Say we have a compromise in the workstation management area, that's not going to be a good day. I'm not going to be excited to come to work tomorrow, but it's a lot better than losing my entire environment in one day. And the more that we can segment these things out, it allows us to really contain the maximum damage that one of these breaches can cause. Whereas the attacks that we see every day, it's often an account that has that privilege everywhere, and it's an extinction level event for organizations. So I guess to finish off today, I wanted to talk a bit about threat hunting in Active Directory, but more from maybe a theoretical level, because I think a lot of Active Directory hunting is often just so noisy, rules just come out that are so noisy that most SOCs just turn them off, and it's not really organization specific. And I think with AD, you kind of need to be org specific. So when I was at uni, we talked about invariants a lot when running software. It's like these, basically within an invariant assertion that's made that for this, at this point in the program, this is how the state should look. And as you're building security controls in your environments, you're making all of these invariants implicitly. So what we're saying is that this thing can't happen because we've got this control. And I think for your environments, you should be making detections that are saying, if you don't believe that thing can happen, then make a detection for when that thing happens. That's like your assert statements through your security controls. Because if you don't have any checks there that this thing could happen, we just assume that it couldn't, those assertions often don't hold. The other one is detections as a to-do.txt. So chatting to Jim Sikora over at SpectreOps, he was telling me that he really thinks that domain admin logins should be a very high fidelity alert, and that every SOC should be able to, every time a domain admin logs in, that's a notable event. But some environments I see that would completely saturate a SOC and just be turned off completely and never looked at again. But the idea here is that just grabbing one of these detects from a library is it's not going to help you, because you're going to find things that are unusual in your environment. But I think instead, set an end goal. So say we don't want domain admins logging into workstations. and add a filter at the bottom of that query that detects that says, actually, we know that this place is bad, so we filter that out. So at the end of this, you've now got a rule for when this thing happens in places you don't expect, but by writing this, you've now got a to-do list of the places you need to go fix, rather than just having a detection that you never turned on. And this is obviously org specific because you're learning about your environment and finding the places you need to target. And finally, harness audit-only policies. So don't paint yourself into a corner where you have to either enforce a control and you're a bit nervous about it, or not turn it on at all. And a lot of these policies these days allow audit-only modes. So, you can turn on something in audit-only mode, use that audit-only logging to build detections, and then find the edge cases in your environment. So research your own environment by building detects. So things like authentication silos in audit-only mode let you see where users are logging in that you don't expect them to be. RPC filters you can put in audit-only mode to see weird authentication or RPC traffic in your environment you didn't expect. NTLM and auditing to see how bad is the NTLM problem or how big is the usage in the environment. And things like Tame My Certs for just saying what kind of Active Directory certificate requests have we got and where have they been abused. And so I guess today, just going over what we've looked at, what we've really done here is a lot of these, we've reduced the lateral movement risk by turning off things, SMB, RPC, where we don't need them and keeping them on where we do. Certificate-based authentication, if implemented correctly, and that's a big if, make sure you've audited your certificate templates, but it reduces the risk of that credential theft if you're on physical smart cards. Things like protected users and silos really limit what authentication mechanisms admins can use to turn off bad ones and limit where they can be used in the case of silos, which really restricts the damage that an admin can cause. And with the final Monash Enterprise model with zones and services, something like that allows you to greatly reduce the blast radius for intrusions in your environment. And this is just looking at the root causes. So instead of looking at, latest whack-a-mole, playing whack-a-mole with all the latest tools, it's a bit more of a look at the core principles here. So we're tackling authentication, we're tackling protocol abuse, all of these systemic problems. Tackling those, we've defeated all of these different ways of targeting Active Directory. And I think one thing that's might be useful is I've put together this slide, which is maybe if you want something to take back to your team, take a photo. But this is a number of different things you can kind of do, say in the next couple of months, to start looking into in your environment. So things like protected users, turning on things in audit mode, enabling armoring. So that's what allows fast to work, which is just something you can just enable for both domain controllers and workstations. Ensuring things like laps are working already, and restricting, for example, where those LATS passwords and privileged accounts can be used, especially over the network. User rights assignments rules are a good way to just start limiting, what can be used remotely. And then I think a lot of these start looking at things like culling your T0 accounts. So that's things like your domain admins. Start looking at where you can opt in or create and start opting in a few test servers to things like disabling those protocols that you actually might not need in a lot of places. And also with things like with silos, start building authentication audit-only ones where you can start seeing, if I put this into place, what would the effect be? And also start looking at, how can I see where you might start seeing places admins are logging in what you didn't expect them to be. And I guess the final stage of this is really, although this could keep going forever and ever, start looking at places, especially for your really sensitive directory admins, things like enforcing that silo for that select group of admins, and start looking at moving them to things like dedicated pores with silos enforced to really limit the damage that those accounts can cause. So I've probably yapped for too long already, so I'm not sure if I have time for questions, but if I do, please hit me up. But here's some resources from, first is the Monash Enterprise Access Model. The next is a reference of RPC interfaces which are grouped by Windows feature. And then also some great resources on how these silos kind of work, And finally, a great resource from the DS internals team about all kinds of firewalling for Active Directory, which is a very, very valuable resource. So I hope this has been a bit useful into exploring some of the ways that Active Directory can be hardened. And thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thanks.